Thomas pushed his food around the plate, not really hungry. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just after midnight on a Tuesday. A trucker sat at the counter nursing coffee. An elderly couple shared a slice of pie in the corner booth, and Thomas, sitting alone by the window, trying not to think about the empty apartment waiting for him. At 58, Thomas Carter had learned to manage loneliness. It had been 3 years since his wife, Amy, passed from cancer. 2 years since his daughter, Jessica, had moved across the country for her career. He was proud of her, truly. But the house felt bigger without her laughter filling it. The waitress, a kind woman named Diane who knew him by name now, refilled his coffee without asking. Thomas came here most nights when sleep wouldn't come. When the memories got too loud. Quiet tonight, Diane said, her voice soft. Peaceful, Thomas replied, giving her a small smile. 23 years in the Navy SEALs had taught Thomas to notice everything. The exits, the people, the small details that others missed. Even now, years after retirement, those instincts never left. They'd kept him alive in places most people couldn't imagine, in situations that still visited him in dreams. So when the door opened and 3 men walked in, Thomas noticed immediately. They were young, mid-20s maybe. Loud. The smell of alcohol drifted across the diner. They took a booth near the back, talking too loudly, laughing at nothing. Thomas went back to his coffee. Not his business. Just some kids blowing off steam. Then the door opened again, and a woman walked in alone. She looked to be in her early 50s, wearing scrubs under a light jacket. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and there were tired lines around her eyes. Thomas recognized that look. Someone coming off a long shift, too drained to go straight home, needing a moment to decompress. The woman, who would later tell him her name was Carol, slid into a booth on the opposite side of the diner from the 3 men. She ordered coffee and soup from Diane, then sat back with a heavy sigh, closing her eyes for just a moment. Thomas watched the 3 men watching her. Something in their body language changed. They were whispering now, glancing over at her, nudging each other. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He hoped he was wrong. He hoped they were just drunk and stupid, nothing more. But 23 years of training had taught him to trust his instincts. Carol's soup arrived. She ate slowly, lost in her own thoughts. Thomas could see her wedding ring, the tan line where another ring used to sit. Recently divorced, maybe, or widowed. Either way, alone. One of the young men stood up. He was tall, wearing a college hoodie, walking with the false confidence alcohol provides. He approached Carol's table. Thomas couldn't hear what he said, but he saw Carol's reaction. She shook her head politely, gave a small uncomfortable smile. The universal language of no, thank you. The young man didn't leave. He sat down across from her, uninvited. Carol's body language changed. Her shoulders tensed. She stopped eating. She said something, her voice firmer now. The young man laughed and called to his friends. They stood up, moving toward Carol's booth. Thomas was already on his feet. He crossed the diner in 6 long strides, his body moving with a fluid efficiency that came from decades of training. He appeared beside Carol's booth so suddenly that the young man startled. "The lady asked you to leave," Thomas said. His voice was quiet, calm, but there was something underneath it, something hard as steel. The young man looked up, trying to appear tough. "We're just talking, old man." "Mind your business." "This is my business," Thomas said, still quiet. He positioned himself between the men and Carol, a protective barrier. "She asked you to leave her alone. So leave her alone." The second man, shorter but stocky, stepped forward. "Or what? You gonna make us?" Thomas didn't move, didn't raise his voice, just looked at them with eyes that had seen things these boys couldn't imagine. "I don't want trouble," Thomas said. "Neither do you." "Walk away." "Tough guy, huh?" The tall one stood up, getting in Thomas's face. "What are you, like 60? You think you can?" What happened next took perhaps 15 seconds, maybe less. The tall man reached out to shove Thomas. It was a mistake. Thomas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. He caught the man's wrist, twisted, and suddenly the young man was face down on the table, his arm locked behind him in a hold that made him yelp in pain. The stocky friend lunged forward. Thomas released the first man and sidestepped, using the attacker's own momentum against him. The man stumbled past, and Thomas caught him with a controlled strike to the shoulder that dropped him to his knees. The third man, seeing his friends neutralized so quickly, backed up with his hands raised. Whoa, man, we're done. We're leaving. Thomas released his holds, stepping back. The two men on the ground scrambled to their feet, both looking shocked and scared. The tall one was cradling his wrist. "You broke my arm," he accused, though he was clearly exaggerating. "No," Thomas said calmly, "I didn't. But I could have." "Leave now." They left, practically running out of the diner. The door chimed behind them, and suddenly the restaurant was quiet again. Thomas turned to Carol, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Are you all right, Mom?" Yes, thank you." "That was. How did you?" She couldn't seem to finish a sentence. Diane rushed over from behind the counter. "Thomas, oh my God, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Diane." "Where did you learn to do that?" Carol asked, finding her voice. "That was incredible." Thomas hesitated. He didn't like talking about his past. Most people didn't understand. They had questions he didn't want to answer, or they looked at him differently afterward. But Carol was looking at him with such genuine gratitude and curiosity that he found himself saying, "I was in the military. Navy SEALs. 23 years." "Navy SEAL?" Diane repeated, her voice rising. "Thomas, you never told me you were a Navy SEAL." "It doesn't usually come up," Thomas said quietly. He looked at Carol. "I'm sorry if I frightened you." "But they weren't going to leave on their own." "Frightened me?" Carol let out a shaky laugh. "You saved me. I was terrified of those men, and you just 15 seconds. That's all it took. 15 seconds and you had them running." "Please, sit down," Diane said to Thomas. "Your coffee's getting cold." "Carol, honey, can I get you anything else?" Carol looked at Thomas. Would you sit with me for a minute?" "I'm still shaking." Thomas nodded and slid into the booth across from her. Diane brought fresh coffee for them both. "I'm Carol," the woman said, extending her hand. "Carol Bennett." "Thomas Carter." His handshake was gentle, controlled. The same hands that had just neutralized two attackers now held a coffee cup with careful precision. "I'm a nurse," Carol continued, seeming to need to talk, to process what had just happened. "Just finished a 12-hour shift at County Hospital. I always stop here on my way home. It helps me unwind. But tonight," she trailed off, her hands trembling slightly around her cup. "You're safe now," Thomas said. "They won't come back." Carol studied him. "Navy SEAL. I don't even know what to say. My ex-husband was in the army, but nothing like that." He used to talk about the SEALs like they were superheroes. "Just regular people doing a hard job," Thomas said, uncomfortable with the admiration in her voice. "That wasn't regular," Carol said. "The way you moved. The way you stayed so calm. You weren't even breathing hard." Thomas shrugged. "Training. It becomes automatic." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Carol said quietly, "I was married for 28 years. My husband left me 6 months ago for a younger woman. Our daughter, she tries to call, but she's busy with her own life. I work long shifts, come home to an empty house, and sometimes I stop here just because." She stopped, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this." "It's okay," Thomas said. And then, surprising himself, "My wife passed 3 years ago. Cancer. My daughter moved to Seattle for work. I come here most nights too, for the same reason." Carol's eyes softened. "The empty house." "Yes. It's strange, isn't it?" Carol said. "You spend your whole life taking care of people, raising children, building a home, and then suddenly you're alone, and you don't quite know who you are anymore." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd never heard anyone express it quite that way. But it was exactly right. After Amy died, after Jessica left, he'd felt unknown. The SEAL teams had given him identity and purpose for over 2 decades. Being a husband and father had given him purpose after that. "But now, I'm a nurse," Carol continued. "I help people every day. But when I come home, There's no one to help me. No one to talk to about the hard shifts, the patients we lose. She looked at Thomas. What did you do after you retired from the SEALs? I tried different things, Thomas said. Security consulting for a while. Then I helped train police and military personnel in defensive tactics. But after Amy got sick, I stopped. Took care of her full time. And after she passed, I just haven't figured out what comes next. Do you miss it? The teams? Every day, Thomas admitted. Not the danger, not the deployments, but the purpose, the brotherhood, knowing exactly who you were and what you were supposed to do. Carol reached across the table and touched his hand. Thank you again for what you did. Those men, they were getting aggressive, and I didn't know what to do. I was about to just leave, let them have the table, go home scared, and then you were just there. I'm glad I was here, Thomas said. They talked for another hour. Carol told him about her work at the hospital, about her son who was in medical school and her daughter who taught kindergarten. She told him about the divorce, the loneliness, the fear of starting over at 53. Thomas told her about Amy, about the 2 years of watching her fade, of feeling helpless for the first time in his life. He told her about Jessica, about being proud and heartbroken at the same time when she left. He even told her about the nightmares that still came sometimes, ghosts from missions he couldn't talk about. When Diane came by to refill their coffee for the third time, she was smiling. You two closing down my diner, she said warmly. I haven't seen you talk this much in 2 years, Thomas. Thomas looked at his watch, surprised. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I should let you get home, Carol said reluctantly. You've already rescued me once tonight. I shouldn't keep you. I'm not in a hurry, Thomas said honestly. Neither am I, Carol admitted. She smiled, and Thomas noticed it reached her eyes, making her look younger. This is the first real conversation I've had in months. Since the divorce, I've been so isolated. Work and home, home and work. I'd forgotten what it felt like to just talk. Me too, Thomas said. They exchanged phone numbers before leaving. As Thomas walked Carol to her car, he insisted, and she didn't argue as she turned to him. I know this might sound strange, she said, but would you want to have coffee sometime? Real coffee, not diner coffee at midnight. Maybe lunch? Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 3 years beginning to thaw. I'd like that. Good. Carol smiled again. Because I think I'd like to know more about the Navy SEAL who saves women in diners. And I'd like to know more about the nurse who stops at diners after midnight, Thomas said. Over the following weeks, they met for coffee, then lunch, then dinner. Carol came to Thomas's house and met the memories of Amy that still lived there. Photos on the walls, her books on the shelves. Thomas didn't apologize for them. And Carol didn't expect him to. She was part of who you are, Carol said simply. I wouldn't want you to hide that. They talked about their childhoods, their careers, their regrets and hopes. Carol learned that Thomas had been awarded medals he kept in a drawer and never mentioned. Thomas learned that Carol had almost become a doctor but chose nursing because she wanted more time with patients. Thomas started volunteering at the VA hospital where Carol sometimes worked. His SEAL training made him valuable for teaching veterans coping strategies for PTSD. He found purpose again, helping others who understood the weight of service. Carol started coming to the diner with Thomas on her late nights. They became a fixture, the nurse and the Navy SEAL, sitting in the same booth by the window, talking for hours. 6 months after that night, Thomas met Carol's children. Her son shook his hand and said, "Thank you for making my mom smile again." Her daughter hugged him and whispered, "She talks about you all the time." Jessica flew in for Christmas. And when she met Carol, she pulled her father aside. "Dad," she said, tears in her eyes, "I've been so worried about you. But seeing you with Carol, you're alive again." Really alive. On the anniversary of that night in the diner, Thomas took Carol back to the same booth. Diane served them coffee and pie with a knowing smile. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, holding Carol's hand across the table, "about that night, about how I almost didn't come here. I'd been sitting at home, staring at the walls, thinking about just going to bed. I almost didn't stop either, Carol said. I was exhausted, wanted to just go home. But something made me turn into the parking lot. I'm glad you did, Thomas said. Those men, they were going to hurt you, and I was there to stop them. But Carol, you saved me too. I didn't do anything, Carol protested. You gave me a reason again, Thomas said quietly. Purpose. Connection. I'd been surviving for 3 years, just going through motions. But that night, protecting you, talking with you, I remembered what it felt like to be needed, to matter to someone. Carol's eyes filled with tears. You matter to me very much. I spent 23 years as a SEAL, Thomas said. I ran missions all over the world, did things I can't talk about, saved lives, ended others. I thought that part of my life defined me. But sitting here with you, I realize something. The best thing I ever did with all that training wasn't on some mission in a war zone. It was spending 15 seconds protecting a woman in a diner. Because those 15 seconds led to this. To us. Carol squeezed his hand. My ex-husband used to say I gave too much to other people. That I cared too much about my patients, my work. He wanted me to be different. But you love that I care. You understand it because you're the same way. We're both caregivers, Thomas said. In different ways. But the same heart. They sat together as the diner filled and emptied. Diane brought them coffee and by and asked about their days. The trucker at the counter nodded at Thomas in recognition. The elderly couple smiled at them knowingly. Thomas thought about all the years of training, all the missions, all the times he'd used his skills to protect others. He'd always believed that was his purpose, to be a warrior, a protector. And maybe it had been, for a time. But now he understood that protection came in many forms. It wasn't just about neutralizing threats in 15 seconds. It was about showing up at a diner when someone needed you. About being willing to be vulnerable. About letting someone past the armor you'd built. Carol had been attacked by loneliness, by heartbreak, by the fear of starting over. And Thomas had saved her from that too, just by being willing to sit across from her and say, I understand. I've been there. You're not alone. And she'd saved him right back. As they left the diner that night, Thomas's arm around Carol's shoulders, Diane called out, see you two tomorrow? Tomorrow, they agreed. Because some routines were worth keeping. Some late-night diners were exactly where you needed to be. And sometimes the person you saved was the same person who saved you back. 15 seconds had changed everything. But it was the hours that followed, the months of conversation and connection, the slow building of trust and love. That's what really mattered. Thomas had spent 23 years as a Navy SEAL. He'd been trained to respond in seconds, to assess and neutralize threats, to protect at all costs. But Carol had taught him something his training never could, that the bravest thing he could do was open his heart again. That true strength wasn't just in fighting, but in healing, in letting someone in admitting you needed saving too. As they walked to their cars, hands intertwined, Thomas thought about Amy, and he knew she'd approve. She'd want this for him. Not forgetting, but living. Not replacing, but growing. Same time tomorrow? Carol asked. Same time tomorrow, Thomas agreed. And for the first time in 3 years, going home didn't feel quite so lonely. Because now he had something to look forward to. Someone who saw past the Navy SEAL, past the protector, past the armor, and loved the man underneath. All because of 15 seconds in a diner at midnight, when a stranger became a hero, and a hero became something even better, someone's reason to smile again.